Welcome to the Diligent Woman Podcast, where Christian women let go of their guilt and step out in confidence by bringing God into every part of the day, learning by examples in Scripture, applying simple principles, and trusting the Lord with it all. I am Angela Legg of thediligentwoman.com, and I welcome you to grow in grace and truth one step at a time. Let's get started. Welcome back to Season 4 of the Diligent Woman Podcast. Join me as we go into episode 403 to study how Moses prayed to save Miriam. Today's study on the vitality of prayer goes and takes a look at a situation in Numbers chapter 12. Here we have the siblings, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And Aaron and Miriam are upset with Moses. His first wife died, and he took another wife, and she's a Cushite. And it tells us in Numbers 12 and verse 1 that Miriam and Aaron didn't care for that. But instead of talking about that with Moses, they bring up a particular issue, and basically they call out Moses for making more of himself, like he's too big compared to everybody else. In verse 2 it says, "And they said, 'Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well?' And the Lord heard it." Now, if we'll remember, Aaron is to be the mouthpiece for Moses, because Moses was so worried back when God sent him to Egypt and to Pharaoh, that Moses was so worried that he was not a good speaker, and he kept making excuses in the early chapters of the book of Exodus, making these excuses that he could not do the speaking, and God provided him an answer. He said, "Okay, then Aaron will speak for you." So God would give the message to Moses, Moses would give it to Aaron, but it is always reflected that it is Moses giving the message throughout the rest of the book. It was Moses that went to Pharaoh, but we also see it's Aaron's rod that is cast down in the issue with the serpents and the battle of the magic serpents. So Aaron is the front man, but it's Moses who is driving it. Moses is the one being obedient, but in this case, Aaron is a prophet. God works with him directly. Miriam is also called a prophet. It is she leads the women in this way, and so God has used both of them. Well, they seem to not appreciate the fact that Moses has more glory than they do. So this comes out when they have their feelings hurt, or they're just upset about Moses' choice of a wife. Well, God hears them. He calls them out, and he calls them on the carpet. He's like, "Okay, I heard what you said." He then goes on to glorify Moses to Aaron and Miriam, to remind them how close Moses is to God, even going so far as to say in verse 8, "With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings." He doesn't make it in confusing visions or things that have to be interpreted. He speaks clearly and directly with Moses. He can give him that clear message, and obviously knows that it can be then given to the people. And it tells us in verse 3, if we back up, that Moses was actually very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. Can you imagine that? God giving that kind of commentary, that Moses was more humble than any other man. So he had not elevated himself. He wasn't taking on more responsibility than God gave him, and he wasn't seeing himself as higher than his brother and his sister. But Miriam and Aaron accused him of doing that, because that's how they saw it. They were being envious. Well, God calls them out. He glorifies Moses, said, "Moses has done what I have told him to, and I shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream." He says God chooses. I choose who I talk to, not you. That's up to me. You don't get to complain about it. You don't get to glory in it too much because you got chosen. I choose who I'm going to speak to, and it's God's purposes that matter. And it tells us in verse 9 that the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left. But when the cloud had withdrawn, because remember at this time during the wanderings, God is revealing himself either as fire or a cloud. So when the cloud had withdrawn from them, Miriam is now leprous. Her skin is white as snow. It is so to the point, of the skin dying, that outer layer of her skin with leprosy. And in a way, this is a punishment both for she and Aaron, but I often wonder if that doesn't mean that she was the driving force behind the criticism for Moses. I don't know, but she is the one who took the brunt of the punishment. But by Aaron's reaction, we can see that this is incredibly distressing. He doesn't get relief because he didn't get the punishment physically. He is distraught over what happens to her, but he doesn't cry out to God. He cries out to Moses, the very one he was just criticizing for taking too much on himself. And Aaron tells Moses in verse 11, "Oh, my Lord, I beg you, do not account this sin to us in which we have acted foolishly and in which we have sinned. Oh, do not let her be like one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes from his mother's womb." He admits this was both of us. This is our sin. Please don't let her take this heavy burden. But he addresses Moses. He doesn't address God. Then Moses, and that's the prayer we want to look at today. What does Moses say in this moment, in this distress for his sister, his sorrow over the whole situation? Can't you imagine? Your siblings are upset with you because of your wife. This is personal. They're accusing you of things that you haven't done, of elevating yourself, of being arrogant and puffed up. So there could be emotional distress all the way around. And Moses cries out to the Lord, saying in verse 13, "Oh God, heal her, I pray." And that's it. One simple sentence. He acknowledges God. This is who he's asking about it, who has the authority to do something about it. He makes clear what he's asking for, asks that she be healed entirely. Notice his prayer doesn't address her sin. He deals with the bigger issue in front of them, and that is the leprosy. Asks for her to be healed, and he simply says, "This is my prayer," or it's no different than saying, "I'm begging you." I'm because that's all a prayer is a begging, a pleading, an asking. So he cries out to the Lord with this simple sentence. God hears him, but he also tells him, "This is right. Somebody needs to bear some punishment because she spit in my face," basically is what God says. He goes, "Wouldn't you expect there to be some repercussion for that?" But he does make it where this is only something that lasts for 7 days, and then she's healed and she can come back into the tribe. So the understanding is the punishment was necessary, but God was merciful and he heard him. He did answer Moses' prayer. He gave Moses what he wanted. He asked that she be healed. He just didn't do it instantly. So how do we look at our prayers when we ask them? Do we have the same expectations? Do we have an expectation that if God doesn't answer it exactly the way I asked it, in the time frame that I asked it, do we count it as God didn't hear us? Well, let's consider for a minute. What can we learn about prayer from this situation? I would put forth that God hears. He hears you. And that all answers are still answers. A no is an answer as much as a yes is. So is a maybe or a not right now. Think of the Psalms that tell us that things are done in God's time, not our own. His time is how things need to move. And to him, 1,000 years is like a day to him. That's nothing. But he is moving things and allowing things to happen in a way that works to our benefit. And we need to trust that. So he still hears. He doesn't change his mind, as we discussed back in episode 402. If you want to go back and look at a time when God prayed a prayer and changed God's mind, that was back on Mount Sinai, and you can go find that in episode 402 at thediligentwoman.com/402. But this prayer shows us that we can cry out to God in our dismay over a terrible situation. Not every prayer needs to be orderly and following a set pattern and filling in all of the blanks and asking things all exactly right. Hi, just a quick break in our episode to talk to you about To Be a Handmaid of the Lord Bible Study Guide. The world offers women nothing but conflicting concepts of what it is to be a woman. This impacts the way women, young and old, make decisions. How we make decisions is often based upon how we see ourselves and the purpose we believe we fulfill. Peer pressure works because you aren't certain about who you are or what you want. For women, the world makes it very hard for them to see themselves as being valuable now or in the future. They are told they need to be more of this and less of that, while inside they are struggling to just figure out who they are in the first place. To help women to stop listening to the world, they need to know how God sees them. It all comes back to knowing you are created by God. He created you to do something. The simple truth is, if God intends you to do it, then logically it means that you can. God cares about you and finds you valuable to His service. Whether you're single, married, old, or young, there is work that you can do. Mothers need to help young women to believe this, to own it. Young women living on their own need to believe it and own it. And married women need to believe this and to own it. Give them the knowledge to empower a life-changing awareness of how they fit in the world in which they live. To Be a Handmaid of the Lord, the Bible study guide, was written to help women to do this. What difference would it make to your daughter or to you if you were convinced of the truth that God knows your potential, that God has value for you that He sees, and He wants you to see it? He's aware of you personally. Would knowing that God cares what you do and feel make a difference to how you see yourself? The Bible is full of practical examples of this. We're not left to figure it out. To Be a Handmaid of the Lord walks you through lessons that build character while showing you the women in the Bible who also reflect that character. Lots of different women, different situations, but each one of them is like you. And throughout the Bible study, you grow in grace and knowledge through looking at God's Word, what He says you are capable of. If that sounds like a study that would be helpful to you, to your daughter, or to your friends, or to your study group, go to thediligentwoman.com/handmaidbsg. That's handmaid, HANDMAID, B like boy, S like Sam, G like go. thediligentwoman.com/handmaidbsg to get your copy of To Be a Handmaid of the Lord and start studying today. Not every prayer has to be like that. In fact, most prayers in Scripture don't follow that exactly. So we don't need to put the burden on ourselves that when we sit down to pray that it needs to follow a particular rhythm. It can be one sentence. It can be in the moment. I would also put forth that someone's sin doesn't need to stop us from praying for their circumstances to be improved. Meaning, I don't need to judge them unworthy of making a request from the Lord. She had just sinned. God called her out. He rebuked her. And He had given punishment. God had dealt with it. Aaron cries out, and he confesses that the sin was theirs. And so all of this acknowledgement of the sin has gone on. But it might be possible that sometimes we won't pray for someone in their calamity because we're so focused on their soul that we think we can't pray for this thing for them today. And I would put forth that that's not true, because that's God's end of the stick. Don't hesitate to pray for someone's tragedy, no matter what you know about their life the rest of the time. Let God be the righteous and merciful judge that He is. Your job is to ask and trust God. God knows what they've done. He knows what they need, and He knows how to deal with it. It's not your job to withhold prayer on their behalf and asking God to bless them because they've done something they shouldn't. We can't pray for sinful activities to be blessed, but that's not what Moses is doing. He's asking for her to be healed. And I think we can learn that from this prayer. Also, I think it's important that we learn that prayer doesn't have to be complicated. Again, back to that prayer that we studied in episode 402. The first prayer in that episode Moses made a very ordered, very logical argument. It was very much like an attorney before a judge. Here is the natural argument to get to this decision. I think you should decide this way. I'm going to counteract what you have put out there, and I've got arguments to that case. He makes the case for not killing Israel. And he does it so well that God changes his mind. But also in the same chapter, when he sees what the people have done, his emotion is heavily fueled. He is angry, and he is obviously disappointed in the people. And when he goes and he metes out the punishment for the people, he directs that. That is done. The next day he goes to God in prayer on their behalf, now having seen what they've done. And he acknowledges that maybe God was right. Maybe destroying them is the thing to do. But if he does, he asks that he go with them. He doesn't want to be kept away from that. He doesn't want to live in that world. His prayers are very different. It's not orderly. It's not an argument like in a case. It's an impassioned plea and an acknowledgement of the depth of what the people had done. Well, here we have another impassioned plea for his sister. Leprosy was a terrible thing to live with. They did have the means oftentimes to cure it. You can go through Leviticus and see all of the different ways that this could be cured. There were time frames given for how long they were to be separated from the people until they were healed and they could come back in. They were to be checked before they came back in and make sure they were completely healed, that there were no spots on them anywhere anymore. And if there still were, they still had to stay separated from the people, and then they had to go through cleansing and could come back. You can explore that. Just use a concordance and look up the word leprosy and go look through Leviticus and all of the direction given to the priests in regards to that. There was a reasonable expectation of being able to be healed. It just was long term, but it's also devastating at the time. Layers of your skin sloughing off is not pleasant, whether you think you're going to live through it or not. Miriam's in a distressful circumstance, and both of her brothers are crying out for her. And that's okay. The other thing I think that we can look for, and I kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago, is when we get what we asked for, but at a time later than we expected, it is still a sign that God heard and answered you. Our trust should not be so fragile that it breaks because we didn't see a miracle happen right in front of our eyes and just completely take care of that thing that we were asking about. There could have been a completely different handling of that God saw was better. We may not understand it, but for whatever circumstances, God may say it's better. We have to trust. We have to trust who God is. That belief, that faith that is established that we know who God is and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, I think that behooves us to be someone who is looking to see what the reward is. In those moments when we are seeking him and we've asked something, because he says, you ask and it shall be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened unto you. He tells us to be like the woman who is persistent with the judge. She wants what's rightfully hers. She has a good claim, a reasonable argument, and she pesters the judge until he hears her and gives her what she's asking for. He tells us to keep asking. He tells us to trust that he's like our fathers, who if they're going to give you something good when you ask for it, God's even better than that. We covered that in our very first study of this season on the vitality of prayer in episode 401. We need to trust God with our prayers. We need to trust him with our requests. We need to trust him with our heart and the lives of the people we love. Moses did. We see him in circumstance after circumstance where he gets frustrated. The people are doing things they shouldn't be, but he continues to go to God and asks for them. And then finally one day he breaks. And Moses says the wrong thing, and he doesn't give God the glory the way that he should. His frustration shines out rather than praying for the benefit of the people, and it costs Moses the land of Canaan. But in all these other times, Moses shows a great love and care for the people. And even after he loses it, he still has great care for the people because he prepares them for what they're doing. Are we like that? Are we like Moses? Do we believe so strongly that a one-sentence prayer as simple as this is enough? That it's enough for God to hear and that God will answer? I hope that you can see that with him. Even though she had to wait a week for her healing, she received healing. All healing is from God. Doesn't matter if it's instantaneous or not. He created the body that facilitated the healing. It all comes from him. But do we trust him enough to believe that? And there's so many other examples that we can look to. You can think about the woman with the issue of blood. She'd been ill for 12 years and she'd spent every penny she had on trying to get it fixed and couldn't get it to stop. It's a long time to have a health crisis. And Jesus healed her. It made no difference whatsoever that she wasn't healed the first time she sought an answer for it. But when she came to Jesus and got one and he gave it to her immediately, that was healing. And it was powerful in that moment because he knew her need. My friend, God knows your need. He knows what you're going through. This is a very personal encounter between these siblings and the Lord. He knows what's going on. He overhears their conversation and calls them out on it. Can't get more personal than that. As a mother, how many times have you heard the confrontation between siblings in the other room or outside, and you got the gist of it and you know what's going on and you call them on it when they had no idea you were listening? God's that way and then some. I would hope that my children can cry out to me for mercy and understanding, because they can to God. And most definitely, if they can call out to me, they can call out to God. He's the better father. So I hope that you'll see that. I hope that you will take the time to study prayer so that you can be more diligent in it, but also that you will make sure that you don't hesitate to pray for somebody's torture in the moment. Whatever is tormenting them, no matter what your judgment is about it, pray for them. 1 Timothy 2 tells us that we are to make all of these different kind of prayers, and one of them is intercessions. That is you going on the behalf of someone else. It's a godly means of prayer. It's a godly means of asking. Supplications is a begging to God, and that can be about you or someone else. This is what Moses does here. We can do that. We can pray like Moses. In humility and in faithfulness, we can pray like Moses. So I hope that you'll be encouraged to do that. And I hope that you'll catch us next time as we look at our next prayer in this series. Be sure and take a look at the prayer challenge that is available down in the description. And take a 5-day prayer challenge to infuse your prayer life with some energy, with worship, and with eagerness. Prayer should be vital. It is your conversation with the Lord. So I hope that you will take advantage of that. And until next week. Thanks for joining me today on the Diligent Woman podcast. Please subscribe to be notified of new episodes and share those with your friends. Until next time, enjoy.